Well, to start with, treaties are agreements between nations that are bought, bled, and bargained for. And the treaty concerning this land was between the Susquehanna Confederation and the colonists, the crown colonists. And there were two treaties. There was one in 1652 and another in 1661. And the signatories typically used, because a lot of people did not write in English or speak in English, they would use some approximation, some image that would serve the same purpose as their signature. And the story of Howard County in particular is rather grim as far as indigeneity goes. But those treaties, you have to understand, are sources of early law. They're sources of law today. Per the Constitution, the treaties are as law of the land, along with the Constitution itself. And so when they're not honored, we are in a state of lawlessness. But regardless of whether the people of this place are here today to speak for themselves, I think we should pay key attention to the promises that we've had before, that come before us, as well as the governance, not just the people as an ethnic group, but we're talking about governments that were here before ours, our mainstream governments. And some of those rights still attach. You have people who are dislocated and relocated or even killed. But those treaties still remain as proof that they were here, that they did have control that was recognized over this place and these places. And that's the significance of it.
And I want to thank Kiros for, generally explaining particularly that image of a tree. But treaties for different tribes throughout the country vary differently. Some are formal documents that the government made. So when colonization happened, a lot of our East Coast tribes and relatives were colonized first, and hence, the understanding of formal written English language, was difficult, yet was pictographs were used in explaining what was, negotiated. But as they went further west, it became more formalized, in a way where, it actually is a policy document, actually. And a lot of the treaties are held with the U.S. government and reflected back again to this day. It's important to understand that treaties are policy documents, but also that they were negotiated with what we consider sovereign nations. So that's what gave us the ability to negotiate those treaties, whereas with other Indigenous peoples in different countries, their process of negotiation is very different. So I often tell people when we're talking and discussing treaties are legal documents with sovereign governments, with tribes in this country, and can be considered like other legal documents that are used with other countries. We hear about treaties with other countries, foreign countries, and that's because they're considered sovereign. Here in the United States, we have actually 3 different sovereign governmental entities. We have the federal government, we have the state government, and we have tribal governments. And a lot of the general American public don't realize that, or not taught that in the educational system. Hence, treaties become an important document when discussing the different sovereigns that we have in this country. So I just kind of wanted to expound on that notion of why treaties are very important to Native tribes.
It is a Maryland treaty. I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that there is a lot of history that goes behind this treaty, and it's very complex. And the Piscataway perspective is a little bit different, but there's plenty of room there for anyone that really wants to know their history to research this. It's not cut in black and white. There's a lot of depth to it.
Begay, Begales, Yanishia, Twahaglini Nishlet, Do Bitadni Bashish Chin, Hani Sani Dashiche, Do Hashlish Dashanella. Actually, I got that mixed around. Hashlish Dashiche, Do Hani Sani Dashanella. Hi, I'm Annie Begay, and this is a very common introduction that we as Navajos do, and it basically denotes our lineage and shows F, which is translated to kinship, to one another. So basically I said, hi, my name is Annie Begales, and I am of the Water That Flows Together people, born for the Within Issues people, and my matriarchal grandfather is of the Mud people, and my patriarchal grandfather is for the Tangle people. And sorry, we usually don't often say this in English, so it's kind of hard to go back and forth with translating all of that. So that is how that makes me Navajo. And I just wanted to say a hi and welcome to a month-long celebration of Native American Heritage Month. And of course, this is sponsored by Howard County Office of Human Rights. So thank you very much. And I think this year we embrace a totally virtual format that allows viewer access across Indian country and across the country to be heard. And I'm so thankful that this format is here, because we're able to hear voices that I have always loved and wished I could implement here in Maryland. So we get to hear voices from Colorado, as well as voices from Utah, people I am also proud to call friends. And I think that Native American Heritage Month definitely gives a voice to an often overlooked demographic. And living previously in places such as Paris and New York City, it never occurred to me that people were unaware that we still existed. And I found it alarming, funny, and an odd request when people would often ask to shake my hand, touch me, take a picture, or touch my hair. I thought it was very strange. And so as life went on and becoming a parent, I decided that this world that I had grown up in, I could change in some way for my children so they didn't have to face the same challenges. So that's what Native American Heritage Month means to me. And I'm going to pass the baton to Kiros, who can talk about some of his issues.
Wingapo, my name is Kiros Auld. I'm president of the board of directors for Native American Lifelines, urban Indian health provider for the Baltimore region, as well as the founder of our Indian Country, which is the largest community on reddit.com, consistently the top 10 native website in the United States. I'm here to speak on my own and on the issues concerning anti-Blackness in Indian Country, and touch briefly on treaty rights as human rights and the basic idea of it. And I've been a Howard County resident for 35 years off and on, that there's a dialectic, there's a relationship between tribes, tribal communities, state governments, and each other. And in between those engagements and interactions and power dynamics, we have issues touching on human rights. If we can boil it down to individual rights or treaty rights, it has a more real impact on us individually and collectively, who is in power, what they decide, whether we have authority over our homelands, and whether we extend the same rights to each other that we, well, say we do on our tribal laws, or do we make exceptions for that? And this is also keeping an eye on the influence of white supremacy in the foundations of federal Indian policy, and as it influences tribal law. And that's a challenge that really comes to light in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, that we are asked as to the presence of anti-Black racism in our own communities, and if not that, then the presence of white supremacy in our tribal laws and among our tribal communities. So I hand it off to the next person. Thank you.
My name is Peter Brooks. I'm a descendant of the historic Piscataway chiefdom, which would be the area encompassed and now known as Maryland. And so with my comments, I want to speak directly to the citizens of Maryland and simply say that, to me, the most important pressing issue is obviously this racism. I think that when you look at the people who organized this event, Nava, Annie, her husband Kiros, their entire family, you have people who have been given their lives to keep this history and these traditions alive. And that is what I call a fire keeper, a person who keeps the fire going. And it's not an easy job. And I think that we as Marylanders need to respect and pay homage and listen to and privilege these people because the voices have been kept silent for so long, and they can make a positive contribution to the quality of life, for all people if they are included. So for me, the most important thing is to honor our fire keepers as a way of defeating racism. I'll pass it to the next person.
Hello, my name is Dustin Jansen. I'm Navajo. I'm originally from Piscataway-Conoy, New Mexico. I'm currently living in Provo, Utah. I'm an assistant professor at Utah Valley University in American Indian Studies and Political Science. And I'm also serving as the director for the Utah Division of Indian Affairs. I think I just listening to the words that have been spoken up to this point, I don't think I can limit my remarks to any one topic, but I will try to contribute and focus in on the issues that seem most prevalent across Indian country today. And I think a good thing that we can offer those of us that are not on the East Coast right now is to show, that although there are 574 federally recognized tribes across the United States, and all of us are different in our own ways, we have a lot of similarities, and we probably are going through the same things together right now, and that we can learn from one another. And I currently in Utah, something that this popped into my mind yesterday after being on the phone with Annie was the importance of stressing the MMIW movement that's going through the United States, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement, and just the violence that Native American women are going through and suffering today. And a daughter of one of our friends was just was murdered, a couple of days ago, and it was a domestic violence situation, but still a Native woman, and especially when you look at the perpetrators in these times, 80% of these perpetrators are non-Indian men or non-Indians. I'll strike men. They're just non-Indians because they could be in a lot of different relationships. And so, I think that's something that we need to look at, something that we need to concentrate on. And all these topics that everyone are bringing together today, they're all connected, and they feed off each other. And you can't work on one without affecting the other. And so it's good to have a really broad discussion on this.
Yat Meredith Lam, Yenishes, and you can my name is Meredith Lam, and just like Annie, introduced herself in Navajo, it is tradition for us as Diné to introduce who we are, and we give our maternal and paternal clan. And so I just said that I was from my mother's clan, born for the Cliff Dwellers clan, and then Many Goats is my paternal side. I come from Arizona, actually, northern Arizona, Page, and it is a border town that is located right on the border of northern Arizona and southern Utah. Currently, right now, I live in Provo, Utah, where I and my children reside, and I am the director for American Indian Education, Alaska Native Education, for Provo City School District, which is a urban school district. And so I get a lot of urban American Indian students that don't live near the reservation, my children included. And I'm glad that we're having this discussion. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. My platform is always education for American Indian youth and our Alaska Native youth. I'm very passionate about that. And every time I go and meet with my students, one thing that I'm sure to tell them, because they are away from the reservation, is I want them to know that when they come to school, I don't want them to feel like they have to shed their cultural skin. I want them to be proud of who they are. I want them to have a voice, and I want them to be able to be seen, whether that's, you know, the amazing perspectives they can give in their classes, or those perspectives that can actually help them, you know, later on in life. Another thing that I've been passionate about is just curriculum correction. And what that means is basically decolonizing our current curriculum, because I feel that especially nationwide, and this is a big reason why I think, you know, we have a Native American Heritage Month, and it's important for us to emphasize that our youth and our children are not being taught correct curriculum in school. A lot of that narrative, a lot of that historical perspective comes from the conqueror perspective. And it's long overdue. I think that we are completely capable as Native people to tell our own stories. And I think that once we are able to give that perspective and give our own narratives, it'll really give our youth a lot more confidence. And so my passion right now, as far as with Native youth, is to make sure that they're heard, to make sure that they're seen, to emphasize that they're not invisible, but that they are a vital part of this country. I love to remind them that you can't look around America anywhere and not see American Indian influence. It is everywhere. This country was built upon the foundings of, you know, the Iroquois Confederacy, their government, and that's something that is long overdue and needs to be re-recognized. I know that they recognized it back, I believe in 1992, but it's something that needs to be re-emphasized. And if so, I mean, just recognize that they were an integral part. Native Americans, the Iroquois Confederacy, were an integral part of founding this country. Not only that, but the influences, the landmarks, the names. Our people knew this land before it was colonized. And I feel like all of that gets forgotten in Native American Heritage Month. And I think school-wise, that's my goal, is to make sure that that curriculum correction, those things that are being taught to our students, you know, come from that Native perspective, because I think that we're capable of telling our own stories, and the power that comes from telling and reclaiming our stories, I think, is really important.
Yat Shea Elton Naswood and Shea, Tohan and Shea Tabaha Bashishin, Nakadana Edisha Chaitat Nizani Edishanella, De Diné and Shla. What I said is good. Hello, my name is Elton Naswood. I'm of the Near to the Water clan, born for the Edgewater clan. My maternal grandfather's clans of the Mexican people, and my paternal grandfather's clans of the Tango people. This is how I identify as Navajo. I'm very happy to be here on this panel to discuss primarily public health issues, as I have a public health background, and just, you know, the advent of the 2020 pandemic of COVID-19, I think is a good time to discuss public health issues, primarily for tribal nations here in the United States, but more so those that do have reservations and live on reservations. You know, I think during this pandemic, we as an American society were very much exposed to the differences socially, culturally, you know, as well as politically, of what's happening here in the U.S., but particularly for Native American people living on reservations. This expounded more so on the healthcare needs for our people and the lack of it thereof, per se. One of the prime issues that I've really become concerned about is the lack of clean water on reservations still in the year 2020. I often tell people in the public health field that we have third world conditions here in the United States, and we need to begin to address some of these issues like clean water, access to healthy food. And during this pandemic, we really saw that evident, particularly on the Navajo Nation, which I would say about a fourth of the people still do not have access to clean water, running water, being able to turn on a faucet like we do, like most Americans do in their homes, which has really affected the spread of the disease primarily on the Navajo Nation. But as Native people, we're very resilient. We treat each other as relatives. And so I'm really happy that there are organizations and agencies that have formed, particularly around issues of caring for our people, but more specifically around the clean water issue. There is the Collective Medicine Agency who organized because they saw a need to provide clean water to our rural relatives on the reservation. So they developed the Water Warriors United. And this was just very grassroots. They got donations. And I personally have friends who are a part of that movement that have taken water to some of our elders as well. So that became a big issue, that I'm hoping that we'll address more collectively to make sure that all Americans have clean water or access to clean water more so and per se. And the other issue that I see predominantly during this pandemic is just the need for tribal governments to build a stronger infrastructure. This pandemic kind of happened, I don't want to say overnight, but it's happened very quickly where, I believe a lot of tribal governments didn't have an infrastructure to deal, with the public health issues, with the emergency issues, that were occurring in their communities. And another issue that highlighted the lack of infrastructure was the distribution of the CARES Act funding to tribal communities and agencies. I know there are a number of tribal governments that are still having to pass legislation to distribute the funding, but they have until the end of this year. So I think that this pandemic has focused and highlighted issues that I know that our communities need to be able to address, to be able to survive such issues as a public health pandemic that we're going through. So I just kind of wanted to highlight those issues. Generally, there are a number of other issues that, I think that also, play a role on our response to this pandemic as well, such as vaccinations. I know there are 2 tribal nations that were approached about being able to use these vaccines that are developed on their own tribal citizens. And I think that needs to be critically discussed as well before that happens within our own communities. So I just wanted to highlight those issues. So I just want to say thank you during this brief time, but, highlighting that as Native people, we are very resilient and we will help our relatives in any way that we can. Yeah.
If we just move straight ahead, and I wanted to highlight the fact that Sandra Hope did write in, and I think this is a question for Meredith, that talks about indigeneity is all around us, but people overlook that because they're looking for basically a Hollywood Indian trope, and they don't see that oftentimes. Meredith, would you like to speak on that at all?
Okay, could you just rephrase her question again or restate it? Sorry.
Her comment was, I always tell people that Indigenous is all around us, but because they're looking for the Tonto and Pocahontas stereotypical interpretations, they don't see it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of our education prior, to it was very romanticized, especially in Hollywood. Hollywood did such a number on the visibility of Native Americans and how they were perceived, in Hollywood films. And a lot of times it was a discredit. I would say most of the times it was, just because it perpetuated this idea of what a Native should look like, what they are like. And as we are American Indian, we know that that's not how we were. That's not how we are. And I think through education, nothing has, I think over the last couple of years, I've attended the National Indian Education conference, which is NIEA, and we hold it nationally every year. But that's been something I think that has been a movement in education, is this idea of decolonizing and reteaching the proper, showing Native Americans in the light of we're still here, we are resilient. A lot of the perspective that we're given in Hollywood and just around us in media are the negative sides, that we don't focus on the positive things and the strengths that come, the stories that come from, from our resiliency. That's victorious for me, as far as when I look at us being able to recreate our stories and have our stories heard, that for me is victory. And it'll take many allies, I think, to really correct that perception. But, I feel like the more that we voice those opinions, the more that we make our viewpoints known as Native people, especially with Halloween just being yesterday, the whole "my culture is not a costume." I think that this country America does racism really well. And everybody is very opinionated. And I think the popular thing lately that people have been saying, that I've been seeing on social media, and plus it's easy to be a coward and to be behind your computer and trolling the internet and just saying what you feel and perpetuating those racist thoughts. But I think it is really brave. And we have a lot of Native and Indigenous people who are stepping forward and saying that that's not okay. Blackface is obviously something that is not acceptable. And you talk to anybody about blackface during Halloween and they would be like, no, yeah, don't do that. That's awful. And I hope that we get to a point to, in education and just in general, as far as the visibility of an American Indian, that we move away and from the whole stereotypical, all these Pocahontas costumes that really do contribute to, the sexualization of women, Native women, and that moves into so many issues. It's damaging, and I don't think people realize how damaging that is. And a lot of times the response will be, well, why are you always so offended? Don't be so offended. Don't worry. Well, these are people that don't know the history. They are people that don't know the culture. They don't know, and they haven't been, and this hasn't been taught in school. All they've seen and all they've learned has been from Hollywood. And that perception of American Indians is not always a positive one. And so this is where, when I say I think that we are strong enough, we have to be together when it comes to having that camaraderie and that common goal of representing ourselves and making our voices known. I feel like now is the time. I feel like now is the time for us to have our voices heard. And so I always just try to be that opinion and that voice, where when I am on my social media, just reminding people, hey, friendly PSA, like let's be respectful during Halloween, and just remember that, my culture is not your costume. There's just a lot of negativity that can come from that kind of perpetuating that image, damaging things that people don't understand. But once, I think that they're educated and they realize what the damaging effects can be, I think hopefully, more respect, more kindness will be prevalent, in the future. But yeah, it's a combination of just a lot of different things of how historically Native Americans have been viewed. But I think we work together and we do what we're doing. We'll move in a positive direction, and hopefully those images will become more positive and more accurate.
The COVID pandemic, it really took a toll on Indian country, and that's actually kind of where I was able to step up. And I didn't even think of amazing people that do take notice in Indian country and are, human rights issues. And I have met two fantastic people, Dimitri Marion and then Blue Adams, who helped form Protect Native Elders, which is a nonprofit group, and we provide rapid COVID response to people across Indian countries or Indian country. And, you know, we've collaborated with great people like Ford, Chrysler, and Microsoft in order to help people throughout Indian country. I kind of wanted to go ahead and go to Elton and then Dusty. I believe Dustin, Jansen, and Elton both have differing but similar platforms. So if you guys want to share dialogue between you two in regards to missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as the COVID epidemic and health-related Native care.
I'll go ahead and go first. I mean, I'll just expound a little bit on missing and murdered Indigenous people. I've heard that term expounded to include more relatives than just women and girls, which would also include our men, our two-spirit relatives, our transgender women as well. It was, you know, that term I heard, missing and murdered Indigenous people, was actually from Representative Ruth Ann Buffalo, who's raised the issue of expanding that acknowledgement to all our relatives. So I'm really always wanting to add that to the conversation. But, you know, that's become an issue within the last, I would say, 2 years, even though we've known that we've had these missing and murdered experiences to our relatives prior to when it's just become very highlighted and become a national crisis. But I'm really glad and really want to acknowledge the grassroots individuals, the survivors, as well as the families, where I think the voices need to continue to be heard for continued healing as well. You know, I know it's become a national conversation with national agencies, with some federal policies, et cetera, that are now implemented. But I always let people know to reflect back on our relatives that are still in need of healing in that way. You know, and another issue with that particular subject is just the lack of data. So really working, I know there are a number of individuals who are working overwhelmingly to begin to collect that data, but I also feel like there needs to be a streamlined sense of reporting, which I know is a big task, but you know, some of the numbers that we do and we hear about, I don't think actively reflect our relatives who are still missing as well. So there's a lot of work to be done around that issue. Last week during the American Public Health Association, there was a special session highlighting missing and murdered Indigenous people, which I think is a great start, where visibility with partners and allies will also be important. So I was really excited to be a part of that session in helping to raise awareness. You know, in terms of back to the pandemic, it's really, you know, we've seen the numbers really devastating a lot of our tribal communities, particularly in the Southwest and the Midwest. And, you know, it's just that continued understanding and prayers and thoughts and traditional medicines, I think, that are helping our own people in that way. You know, so really doing that reflection back to, you know, I believe early on in the pandemic, I heard a phrase of cultural humility or cultural resiliency, in terms of really being able to focus back to our traditional values on how to protect ourselves and help our families. But collectively, the response, I think, is, you know, is going as best as it could. You know, I know a number of our people have passed from, you know, from the disease, and our hospitals and clinics are still overwhelmed in that way. And I'm just kind of very concerned of the post effects of this pandemic, particularly around our mental health, our spiritual health. I know a lot of our people stopped their ceremonies or postponed their ceremonies due to the large gatherings, you know, that we're accustomed to, you know, and in my own thought process, that lends to an imbalance. You know, these ceremonies, these songs, these prayers are done for a reason, you know, and we weren't able to do that in the last month. So I'm, I'm hoping we can collectively come together and put our world in balance, in that way, and be able to gather socially and culturally, and provide those ceremonies that are needed. So this pandemic, as I always think and have always been taught, happened for a reason, and not in a good way per se, but it lends us as Indian people to really reflect back on our survival, our activity, our cultural activities, our songs, our prayers, our ceremonies, to put us back into balance. So I hope, that will be something that would be positive to take from this situation, in that way. But the other issues that I did mention about the lack of clean water, the access to healthcare, vaccine preparation, tribal infrastructure are all important issues as well. And another issue is electricity and the access to internet. We're seeing that throughout Indian country, particularly for our young, our young people, our students who are needing to go to school, but they don't have access to the internet or even a laptop. So we're seeing those, discrepancies as well. So hopefully we can highlight these issues, but then find ways to address these issues for our tribal communities. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add on to that, and I'd first like to thank Elton for his words and sharing those things. I think we're realizing that there's not just one issue that's affecting Native America, and it's going to take any one of these issues could take a couple hours to speak on and still not come to solutions, but we could come up with ideas that we need. Right now, at least in Utah, the state of Utah has put together a missing and murdered Indigenous women's, girls, and peoples task force to address that issue. We're working with all the 8 tribes in Utah, and we're going to meet with them soon to talk about how this has affected each of those tribes and how we can again start accounting for numbers, start building upon a database that just doesn't exist as expressed, and hopefully move forward in addressing this and about why it's happening. I would also like to add on to what Meredith Lam had to say about education and the importance of it right now. I was asked to speak at the Utah Civics Teachers Conference, and I spoke about how they asked how can tribal government be incorporated into the American civics classroom, and we talked about that. We talked about the Constitution setting up as being set up as a source for federal and state powers, and then addressing, well, where do tribal rights come from, and leaning on what Kiros had brought up. They've always been there. When people came and landed on the shores of what we call the United States today, they decided to make treaties with the indigenous people that they came in contact with. Treaty making is a sovereign function. That's what one sovereign does with another sovereign. You don't make treaties with another race of people. You make treaties with another political entity, and that's important to realize. And the reason why they thought they could do it is because they recognize these tribes as government entities and having political control over these lands and that's important to realize. It's important to realize that tribal power or tribal sovereignty does not come from the U.S. Constitution. It pre-existed the U.S. Constitution. It pre-existed the signing of this ratified document that everyone's been talking about lately, about when especially it comes to wearing masks. You're interfering with my First Amendment rights, and these rights you're talking about that stem from this U.S. Constitution. Tribal sovereignty pre-existed all of that, and it's important to realize and understand that. So by building off what Meredith Lam said, I think being able to see Native people today you'd have to be taught that their governments exist today. If you're not teaching that tribal governments exist, then there's no reason to, there's not a whole lot of evidence for young kids today to know that Native people exist at all. And so I would hope that every state would try to move forward in that. On the pandemic itself, that's just it's a really horrible time and an experience for so many people. I'm grateful for our tribal communities and tribal governments that have been able to step up, that have been able to put their people first and really try to take care of one another. The disparities, the pandemic hit tribes late. And so by the time tribes were needing PPE or testing things, the states had already gobbled those up, and it was hard. It was hard to treat people and to test people when none of those things were available to tribes. But I'm so happy that so many tribes have done what they thought was right and securing the health of their people. And for many tribes, the Navajo Nation, even, as large as it was and as hard hit as it was, they're doing their best, and you can see the results of that. Something that Elton brought up was this digital access, right? Access to the internet. In Utah, almost every school went online, and there was we found out in rural Utah and even in urban areas of Utah that there were families without the internet. And we didn't have the infrastructure in many places to provide the internet. And we think about, it's internet computers, but really what we're saying is there's thousands and thousands of students throughout Utah that didn't have equal access to education. And that's what it came down to. It wasn't about computers. It wasn't just about internet. It was about what those things brought to these students. They needed an education. And luckily, I think the state of Utah is doing everything in their power to make things happen. They've issued out Chromebooks to everyone. They're expanding on internet towers. They're working with tribes and the federal government to get over right-of-ways and permitting issues to lay down broadband in rural areas. And it's good to see that, but those aren't going to happen tomorrow. These are happening. These are things that are going to take years to come by and to fix and to remedy. And so I'm grateful for what's going on there, and for this platform here, just to bring it out and for people to hear and maybe speak with their friends and share to see if solutions can come about. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody here, but I also would like to have a rider there that indigeneity is local, that a lot of what gets lost in American exceptionalism is our place, our proportion, and our recognition in the scheme of things. Our treaties, for example, Pamunkey, which was the leading nation in the Powhatan Paramount Chiefdom, it's Pocahontas people is how people know us. That's our place in the settler colonist myth. And we often get talked over and around and about and don't necessarily have a voice in a lot of that when it comes to, say, the Pocahontas slur controversy, or even the telling of the myth itself, or in the Disney movie. But we're still here, and our treaties come from wars in the 1620s and the 1640s and the conclusion of Bacon's Rebellion in 1677. And we've kept our treaty lands from the 1640s treaties up to today. And still the party that we treated with was the Crown Governor of Virginia, and by extension, the British Crown itself. Yet we received acknowledgement in 2016, and that land is still held in trust by the state, not by the federal government. There's a lot that slips through the cracks in history, and there's a lot of indigeneity that is all around us that we really miss out on, and there is some accountability there too. Going back to MMIW, that's something I did want to talk about just very quickly, that it's not something that we in Maryland localities are necessarily exempt from. Clearly not. We had Tiffany Jones of the Lumbee tribe, who was, she was kidnapped, she was stripped, she was assaulted and she was murdered and she was burned in a car. And this is an adult here. And part of the friction that comes with, I have any number of stories about this, and I try not to name people out of respect, because some of these are also family stories. And part of the question becomes, when we talk about MMIW, people have to remember that it doesn't just happen on reservations, that you don't stop being Indian when you leave your trust lands, your treaty lands, and you still face situations, regardless of your acknowledgement status, where you will get treated differently, and there will be some inflection based off of how the outside sees you. They don't ask who you are. They will latch on to different things about yourself that comes from your indigeneity in other majority communities that do make you a target. And cities are notorious for eating Indians. But I find myself having to spell out to people that MMIW stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, and it should include men as well, persons, and LGBTQ2S as well. But it doesn't just, it stands for something, a group of people who are subject to this kind of violence, a species of violence, and it doesn't necessarily involve what their blood quantum is, what their enrollment status is, what their recognition status is. And I find when people take a look at who the victims are, that question does come up, and it is part of what denies people their very humanity, their indigeneity. And we need to be very careful, because we live in the shadow of a federal Indian policy that had the end goal really to get us to a point where they didn't have to treat with us anymore, that they didn't have to resort to using force or armies to get rid of us, that they could just get rid of us with a stroke of the pen. And they outsourced that job with us through challenging policies such as blood quantum and lineal descent that is actually curated by persons who are not us a lot of the time. And we have to be extraordinarily careful about where our sovereignty comes from, where our indigeneity comes from, where our sense of being and kinship come from, and not getting too wavy gravy. And it really just does depend on what specific community we're talking about here and their individual history. But these things have teeth as to Indian country. They have teeth as to our tribal governments in our communities, and whether we get the rights that are on paper or even within our own tribes, and whether we get to count as persons within that context, and then the context with regard to the mainstream. So I'm thankful for everybody here in the company and this talk and this time.
Wow. How can I follow up with that, Kiros? That was excellent. So much was brought out there. The issue of women, Indigenous women, is extremely disturbing. It's a very difficult issue to deal with, and it does span all the Americas. It includes our brother in South America, Mexico. There's just this inherent vulnerability. And the one issue that I wanted to talk about in terms of a personal one for me is the idea of language. And as I understand it, traditionally in the First Nation, if we spoke the same language, we were not ever at lack disagreements generally, because we were able to communicate and understand each other through the use of language. And so language preservation, language utilization, a lot of people say, well, I have part Indian. I want to be more indoctrinated in the culture. What should I do? Andrew pointed out, figure a man to guide them into their spiritual journey or whatever, when really it's the hard work of just learning the language. I mean, I think that's fundamental if you're going to walk that red road, is to really get your language, not just the inherent language, but also the way in which people describe you and speak about your issues and stuff like that. And I think also that the preservation of the language, the history and the culture. These are the things that people are interested in when they want to know about us as a species. And I think ultimately, when you look at the human species, we're all one people. And what separates us is not our complexion, but our languages. And so that's why I think that's an important human rights issue.
So I wanted to just make people aware, like I said, this is a virtual platform, which gives us the opportunity to hear from some people that we otherwise might not be able to in Maryland. I'm so grateful to have and know such wonderful friends across the country that are able to speak on such great issues. I've gotten a lot of feedback in regards to every point that has been touched on. Miss Sandra Hope is a friend I know from the Holowa-Saponi tribe. I got the name correct. And she has brought up a lot of great points here. She talked about rarely hearing horrific Indigenous people violations on mainstream media. And as Kiros suggested, the federally recognized people aren't well known, much less the state recognized or non-recognized tribes. And that, of course, feeds into what Dusty Jansen, Elton, Naswood, and Meredith were all speaking on, which is the missing and murdered Indigenous women. It is definitely something that could and should get more light in mainstream media, as we have actually a higher percentage rate of most everything, actually, of touching COVID, of violence, of human trafficking. So, I mean, these are all topics that we can speak on quite a bit. I am thankful that there are so many men that were able to contribute. I would like Meredith to speak up a little bit more in regards to how we can help people to be more familiar, like what people might be able to move forward with Native American Heritage Month in seeking out lessons, or just something to become familiar with, maybe debunk some myths that, everyone tends to think that we speak Indian. Can you speak Indian? Do you live in a teepee? Do you ride a horse? Do you wear buckskin? Obviously, as natives, we know that as 574 federally recognized tribes, we all have our different cultures.
If you are educators, as your parents, here's two different things. You gotta, with education, I think, I'm lucky enough to have Dusty and his wife in my district. And so there's been a lot of really meaningful collaboration that I have learned from them. I look at them as mentors and as parents who are active. For those Native parents that are there, your local education agency, which I know with government, we like to use a lot of acronyms. It's known as your LEA. Your LEA should have an organized program of federally recognized programs. So with those, you usually have like a federal program director who looks over those programs. Title VI is the American Indian Alaska Native education program that is nationwide. So if you are in an organized LEA, I would ask and see if you guys even have a Title VI program available. You have to have 10 Native students to actually who are actually registered tribally, or they have to have their parents registered or a grandparent registered. I think they stop at grandparent. So on the Title VI registration form, in order to be a part of that program, you either have to have your own registration, your parents' registration number, or your grandparents. So 10 students total to make a program, a Title VI program, but that is through the Department of Education. And I think that when you tap into those programs, a lot of times they can segue into allowing you access to the Native American community, the Alaska Native community. And those programs are usually open to the public. I know that all of my parent advisory committee meetings are open to the public, so anybody can actually attend those. As you know, as being a public service, transparency is key. And so we try to make it so that everyone knows that they're invited. But as far as the activities and what we go through, those actual activities are set aside and are meant for students that are in the Title VI program. But as far as the meetings and learning, I mean, I usually open that, have like an open door policy and let people know that they can always be a part of that. As far as you being a parent, please email me. I'm going to give you my email. It's Meredith, my first name, Meredith, the letter L, at provo.edu, and Provo is provo.edu. We had some parents on our parent committee organize this wonderful letter that is pre-drafted, and you can send it to your principal, your administrators, your teachers, and it's just a great letter to let them know, like, hey, this month is Native American Heritage Month. Also, it is the month of November. We know that, teachers are already rolling out lesson plans for the first Thanksgiving. Please, be a little more sensitive when teaching this. And it's worded very eloquently and very kind, but it's very direct. And I'd be happy to share that letter with anybody who needs or feels like they would need to give that to their administrators. A lot of times parents are very, they feel like they can't approach the administration. They feel like they can't approach their teachers, or maybe the teachers, but the principals and upper administration. But your voice is so important as a parent. Really, you make a huge difference in your child's education when you speak up. That is just key in any, in any group. And so having your parents involved is really important, and to be a concerned and willing parent, to step forth and make your voice heard on behalf of your children is really important. As far as the curriculum goes, there's a lot of, this is something that I know that NIEA has been trying to hone down, but there's a lot of great resources. One of them that I do want to share, and I don't know how we can make these links available, but Annie, I'm willing to share these if you want to post them somewhere later. I really love, for the literature side, there is on the firstnations.org website, so that's firstnations.org. There's a great, if you go on their website, they have native reads. It's hashtag native reads. They've got a recommended reading list for Native children from Native Indigenous authors. And so it's a great reading list. It's been really thoughtfully put together. There's some great book recommendations. So I really love First Nations. Another, firstnations.org. The other one that I was thinking, as far as curriculum, I feel like PBS has really stepped up and has really done a great job. And they actually have, if you were to just Google pbslearningmedia.org and then Native American Heritage, you will be sent to the link of their collection for Native American Heritage Month. And what's great about this is they actually have every video, it's all friendly, and it's divided out in age group and grades. They have wonderful resources, and I always like to shout out PBS because I think they've done such a wonderful job in putting that Native American Heritage collection together. So that's one that I would definitely recommend. As far as curriculum goes, there's a wonderful curriculum that Meredith Lam, who is Omaha Indian, in our district here in Utah, she was able to capture a Running Strong teacher grant, and she has compiled 2 editions of actually curriculum books. And in those books, there's some wonderful lesson plans. I've even had political science teachers in high school reach out to me and ask, what's a great lesson plan that I could do for, the upper grades? And I think Meredith has even a great lesson plan in her second edition, I believe. But it's about having the students go through the process of what it takes to register or be a federally recognized tribe. And so that class actually goes through and they see the steps that it takes for tribes to be federally recognized. I mean, there's so many creative things that, teachers can be doing where they can actually learn about tribal government. They could learn about what it takes to You know, because even the basics of being American Indian itself, you know, a lot of people don't even know that the start of that, you know, is because we have that legal recognition as being Native American or Alaska Native. It's our right to sovereignty. And when I explain it that way to professionals, to teachers and principals, they're like, oh, yeah, I just kind of always think of it as a culture. And yes, it is a culture. We are a people, but we also have that legal recognition. It's our right, you know, to sovereignty that really makes us separate from any other group. And so why wouldn't we learn about that? Why shouldn't we learn about that? I think that's something that is an integral thing that should be part of every education. So hopefully as the years go by, you know, we can kind of include all of this. We can get this information out. So, I mean, educators, parents, if you want to contact me, I'm happy to share what I have. I just put out for our district this last week for our teachers and principals, a whole reference of the link recommendations that I'm recommending for them. And if they're ever questioning their lesson plans, to email me, and I'm happy to look over their lesson plans to make sure that it's appropriate. And I do get a lot of teachers that do send in those recommendations and that send me lesson plans. And it's kind of alarming, actually, to see some of the lesson plans they were thinking of teaching. A lot of them involving, you know, like cutting out feathers and paper bags and making vests and headdresses. And I'm just like, we got to stay away from that. There's so much more depth. There's so much more history that we can teach in the educational realm. And as parents, that is up to you. It's really important for you to make your voice heard. I think that is really what gets educators in the public realm, public school, is for you to speak up and make your voice known. And don't stop, just keep going. I love that about Dusty and Chama. They've really revitalized the Native community, even though we are less than 1% here in Provo. I feel like they have been this wonderful example of what it means to be proud Native parents and to support your kids in their education, because this is how we're going to get the ball rolling. I think this is how we make change. It's, you know, I could sit in this position all day and say what I feel, but when administrators and educators see that parents are actually passionate, then they take note. Then they're like, okay, this is important, and don't give up. Keep going. I mean, just keep you know, sending in your requests. And there's nothing bad about sending a letter and saying, could you please be a little more culturally sensitive? Reach out to your Title VI coordinator if we do have one. A lot of times these educators are willing to look into that, and a lot of them probably have not been trained on how to teach, you know, these lessons. But you know, there's so much that can be done that I'd be happy to share those references with you. I don't know if after this we can share that, but I'd be happy to include my email and the references I gave for our district.
I did want to take a moment and say that Meredith actually did bring up a really good point, which was why Howard County gets all of this in the first place. I was actually horrified when my child started in the public school system, and I had offered my services free to help with this class, and I was told, oh, no, we're going to be reading these few books written by first generation Irishmen from Boston writing about the Plains tribes, and they were going to be making Indian talking sticks and Indian buffalo robes, which no tribe that I'm aware of has either of those. So it just kind of irks me when I hear people refer to things as Indian or Native American. Like we said, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. We each have our own languages, our own traditions, our own ceremonies, cultures, style of dress, places to live. I mean, I think that's so important to notate. I'm so thankful that all of these panelists were able to join us, and I know that COVID has really thrown a wrench in a lot of things, but I do feel like for this purpose alone, it has done us wonders, because like I said, I was able to get friends from across the country that I feel are so such strong, educated voices in Indian country, and they deserve to be heard. So I'm really thankful for Meredith for sharing her educational background with us on how to help the children. I'm so thankful to Elton Naswood, who was able to help and put in his help platform of that, and Dusty Jansen from a governmental level, and bringing up missing and murdered Indigenous women. Peter Brooks joining us from right up the road here in Maryland, as well as Kiros Auld bringing up his issues. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating. And also Sandra Hope, the silent voice, who did bring up a lot of issues as well. And like I said, she's in Virginia. Thank you to all the educators that have logged in, and we will provide you with resources